Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marlene Biener, and I'm Senior Counsel at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. APA is a national nonprofit organization located in Washington, D.C. We serve prosecutors as well as their law enforcement and community partners. Thank you to all for joining our webinar today. Today's webinar is on the implementation of Prosecutorial Performance Indicators, or PPIs. PPIs are an effective tool to increase prosecutorial transparency and efficiency, and the focus of today's webinar is specifically on assessing and building staff and data capacity. This webinar is made possible by the support of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge. We're fortunate enough to be joined today by two wonderful speakers. We have with us Dr. Rebecca Dunlea, who is an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice at Florida International University. Her research specialties include prosecutorial discretion, quantitative analysis, and inequalities in courtroom case processing. She's also a co-manager of the PPI project, and in that role, she has worked with prosecutors' offices across the country to extract, analyze, and improve their data. We're also joined today by Caroline Wong, who has worked at the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office as a deputy DA for the past 20 years. And although most of her career was spent doing traditional prosecution work, she now supervises the research unit, the restitution unit, and works on prison diversion and other innovative criminal justice programs within the Multnomah County DA's office. And she's also the lead PPI manager for her office. Today, the speakers will discuss maximizing staff capacity to properly analyze, interpret, and present PPI data. The presenters are also going to be sharing their experiences and their expertise on conducting a thorough data assessment to help identify internal and external data sources, evaluate which PPIs can be measured, and determine what new data can be collected moving forward. This webinar is the second in a series of webinars focused on PPI implementation. They take place the final Thursday of every other month, and our next session will be on September 30th, Thursday, September 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on office-wide engagement. So please save that date, and we'll be sending registration information for that webinar shortly. So for today's webinar, the presenters encourage attendees to ask questions throughout the course of the presentation. You can submit questions for our speakers using your chat function on the toolbar located on the bottom of your screen. And if you need any additional assistance, we do have some tech folks with us here to assist you. So please feel free to reach out. So Caroline, Rebecca, thank you both so much for presenting for us today. Before we begin the meat of the presentation, Rebecca, for those in the audience who are new to the concept of PPIs, could you provide us with a little bit of a high-level overview of what PPIs are?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you for giving us, helping us create this space to talk about the PPIs and more generally about data work and prosecution. So I'm delighted to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Rebecca. I'm one of the co-managers of the PPI project. And along with my colleagues at FIU and Loyola, we are very interested in promoting the use of data in prosecution. So the PPIs are at their core a set of 55 performance indicators that tap into broad goals of effectiveness, efficiency, and fairness. And more specifically, they reflect a wide variety of values and objectives in prosecution. So we envision the PPIs as having three broad purposes for prosecutors. They can first be a tool for office management. So they can help offices understand their staffing needs, workflows, evaluate case dispositions and such. The data from the PPIs can also serve as a performance management tool at the office level. So kind of show the impact of various policies and practices and help offices measure and track progress toward internal goals that the offices have set for themselves. And then the third purpose of the PPIs, and really a purpose of any data that a prosecutor's office collects and shares, data can be a really important tool for achieving transparency and engaging with local communities in like a meaningful way. So what you as a prosecutor's office measure and share can reflect your values and reflect your priorities. And then data can be a vehicle for showing the public what you do and how you're improving their quality of life. So in the nutshell, that is the PPIs.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And Caroline, before we get started, you all are participating in this PPI project. Could you talk to us a little bit about what first interested you and your office in the PPIs and where you are now in the project and where you hope to go?
Sure, absolutely. So we have a newly elected DA in our jurisdiction, and he ran on a platform of transparency and being data-driven. So the project was a really good fit for our office. It provided a really great roadmap and concrete examples of the wide variety of prosecutor performance indicators that we could be analyzing in addition to what our office was currently doing in terms of the traditional data you think of when you think of prosecutors' offices, like referral rates, issuance rates, and so forth. We're currently in the, understanding our capacity in terms of long-term maintenance, and then in the analysis phase of all of the PPI. We currently don't have any measures published to the general public, but we have worked and partnered with a partner research university, Portland State, who's done the interview and the survey portion for us, and then we're just waiting on those results. But ultimately, our goal is to get as many of the 55 PPI done as possible with some modifications where necessary, and then also to include any other metrics that we feel is important for our jurisdiction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to the both of you to get us started with our presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if this, okay, so are you looking at a PPI slide now? Awesome. All right. Okay, so in this webinar, we want to cover how to assess and build, that's the important part, staff and data capacity in preparation for doing a data-oriented project in your office. So there's kind of two parts to that, right? Staff capacity and data capacity. So I would like to start by talking kind of about what staff capacity looks like and how to build it. And then in the second half, we can talk more specifically about the mechanics of data that works. Let's see here. If I can move it. There we go. Okay. So key staff needed for a data-related project. I will start with what I would perceive to be the most important or the most central member of a prosecutor's office that might be involved in a data project would be your IT or your data analyst, the person who's actually working directly with data that comes out of the systems in your office. So to help prosecutors' offices figure out what their current capacity is and figure out where they want to be moving forward, we kind of have this multi-step chart here that shows the different general capacities that a prosecutor's office might have for doing analytic work. So at the bottom of this ladder, we called it no analytical capacity. Many prosecutors' offices will say, well, we have no analytic capacity, but I actually think very few offices would fall here. No analytic capacity means that everything is essentially still recorded on paper files only in your office. And if that's the case, the most important first step in a data project will probably be introducing and using an electronic case management system moving forward. Because using data in a meaningful way is much, much more difficult to do when all of your data, all of your cases are processed using paper only. Case file review is a very intensive process. It takes a lot of time and resources, and generally the output from that won't be quite as useful. So if an office genuinely believes that they have no analytic capacity and everything is still recorded on paper only, then considering electronic case management systems will be a very important step moving forward. But as you move up this ladder, you get more and more capacity. And I will note one important kind of progression is as you move up the rungs of this ladder, you tend to get more flexibility, kind of more responsivity in the data work that you do. And the data work that you do will also probably be more sustainable long-term. So most offices that we have worked with will fall into one of the three rungs in the middle. They'll either have IT personnel, so those individuals who work directly with a case management system or other electronic systems in your office, but don't really have analytic capacity. Like they're not trained or used to running any kind of statistical analysis, whether it's using an Excel spreadsheet or anything else. They're really your technical folks who fix bugs in the system and will troubleshoot when something goes down. But they're not analytic people generally. Another common, well, luckily more common situation that we're finding now is that prosecutors' offices have the opportunity to partner with local researchers to do analytic work. And there are universities all over this country with individuals, whether they have PhDs or masters or what have you, that are looking for data and are interested in doing analytic work. They just don't have the connections or the resources to reach out or figure out what data your agency has. So local partnerships is a great way to kind of advance the work, the data work of a prosecutor's office without having to hire anybody new internally. If you're interested in this kind of a partnership, just figure out what your local university is, reach out and start asking who would be interested in working with our data. We're looking to fulfill these objectives and we need some help. And we hope and we believe that there are lots of opportunities for such partnerships to be very fruitful. The next step up in the ladder is acquiring or having a dedicated analyst within an office. And the benefit of having a dedicated analyst is that this person will be embedded in your office. They will figure out or learn the environment a lot faster than a research scientist from a university would. They'll be much more responsive and able to crank out data requests quickly compared to somebody who works externally. And just generally, it will be a better long-term solution to doing data work. If that's something that you don't have a particular short-term data project in mind, you just want to see what's out there and figure out the best ways moving forward, a dedicated analyst would be the best way to do that. And then at the far end, we're seeing a few offices, usually those with extremely high amounts of data and analytic resources, or those that have dedicated units. And they will have as many as 10 or 20 people analyzing data and helping the office improve policy and practice. So as a first step in assessing your staff capacity, you want to figure out where on this ladder you fall. And also keep in mind moving forward what you think a feasible progress would look like. So not only where you are, but where you want to be and where you think you can find yourself in 1, 3, 5 years will be important in a project like this.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Caroline, where does your office fall on this ladder? And how do you work with that person to help you analyze, present and interpret the PPI data?
Yeah, our path was interesting on this scale. So, we didn't start at the bottom. We kind of started in the middle and then kind of spread out from there. So 10 years ago, if you're talking about analytic capacity, we had one person that was assigned to IT who was able to pull or extract data from our case management system and who had some ability to use Excel, right? So she could provide us with, some charts and tables associated with the data that she was pulling. But we really wanted to expand and really grow our data. And so then the decision was made to include a practitioner or a data savvy line prosecutor to work with IT to see if we could sort of expand our capacity there. And so they did that initial assignment, which was my position, work with IT, make it happen, make it grow. So we kind of went right down a little bit to include a prosecutor. But then as part of us looking at our data, I realized I'm not an analyst, right? So I know how our system operates. I know what our case management database says, but I can't actually do any of the analytics because I don't have the background. So we looked into partnering with our local research university, Portland State University, to figure out whether we could hire interns from their graduate program. And we ended up growing into the research scientists from a local university by hiring interns and then partnering on specific projects with professors at PSU. And so with the interns, we figured between me and the professors, one, I could teach them about our case system, and the professors could help them with the analysis. So that's how we kind of started growing our unit. And then from there, we thought, okay, now that we have a foundation, we're in a good place to start looking for grant opportunities to hire, a dedicated analyst into our office, which we did about 4 years ago. We received a grant and we hired our first person. And then from there, we could show county commissioners, hey, this is really working. We're producing really interesting data analysis out of our shop. Will you give us general funds so that we can actually hire another analyst and kind of grow our unit? So we finally got to that top rung just at the beginning of this year with the county giving us general funds for another analyst position. And then we hired a bunch of additional interns to sort of help us with the work. So, it was slow for us. It definitely spanned a good number of years to get to where we are now, but that's how we got there.
I think it's really helpful to know that although this does make sense to do this work linearly, that it's okay to sometimes go back and go to another rung of the ladder and try and do things in a way that just makes the most sense for you and your office. And it's really great to hear that you were able to connect with Portland State and get those interns. Was it you all having the idea and then reaching out to them? Was there already an established connection there between you and the university, or how did that relationship really get started?
So we never had an ongoing relationship with PSU. They would reach out every now and then to see if there was some data we could give them because they were working on a specific project where they, wanted access to either court data or DA data. So we knew that they were a thing and they were available, right, to do work on projects, but we didn't have a regular partnership. That was really only when we were thinking about, if we don't have funding, right, to have our own analysts in-house, then can we partner with them in a more meaningful way? A more meaningful way meant actually sitting down on a month-to-month basis and having conversations about what was happening in our shop and what interest they had in sort of vetting some of the programs, more innovative programs that we were getting started, and to figure out, how could they be helpful? What type of interns could they provide to us? Could they be promoting our office, so that we could hire interns on as regular staff after their internship was done? And so it was a really conscious effort, I think, on our part to start that partnership.
That's really helpful. And then my last question to, I think, maybe both of you, and I know you mentioned that you all had grant work that was able to help you fund some new analysts. Could you talk a little bit more about that process? And Rebecca, if you have any additional insights there, that might be really helpful for those who would be interested and don't know exactly how to get started in that process.
Caroline, would you like to start and I'll pick up?
Sure. So just really briefly, we were looking at everything we possibly could to figure out, is there money available and can we turn it into an analyst spot? What we realized was there's actually a lot of grant money available that's pretty broad. And so we could really design sort of our own job description around it. And if we could demonstrate we really had a need, which we did, that's how we ended up getting the position that we did.
Yeah, and I like the approach that you all took too, and it's something that I'll echo, that you didn't just make this jump from no capacity to a ton, that you kind of moved, you added one person or one new analytic skill to the mix, and then you leverage that to bring on another person, and kind of build out. I think one of the things that we found is that in order to get grant money to help you build data capacity, it helps to have a little bit of data available to kind of show what the impact of your office currently is. And we have helped a number of jurisdictions that we work with directly apply for, in particular, federal grant money from agencies like Bureau of Justice Assistance, who have ongoing prosecutorial related projects and will fund agencies to use new and innovative methods like data analysis and more data informed prosecution. Those kinds of funds can, if allotted and applied for correctly, be used to hire new analysts and such. So grant writing is definitely an avenue for expanding analytic capacity. It really helps to have even just like key indicators or key data from your office to support applications like that. So knowing how many cases are referred and disposed, knowing the crime rate in your area, and being able to kind of show that you are already using data in, as best you can as an office, I think will help with that process. But looking for external funds, I think there are a number of different federal, state, and often local agencies that are very interested in supporting this kind of analytic capacity building. Okay, so I guess we can move forward. All right, other key staff that you might want to consider, or an office might want to consider bringing on or incorporating into a PPI or other data-related project. It needs to be somebody's job to keep a data project on track. So a PPI manager or a data project manager is very important in a large-scale data initiative like the PPI work. Offices will quickly find that there are many moving parts to any data project. A PPI project is no different. And if there isn't one person who knows they are responsible for managing, the diffusion of responsibility will make it a lot more difficult to keep things going. So find a PPI manager in your office, somebody like Caroline, who's fantastic in this role, who is very organized, who supports the initiative and understands the value of bringing data into an office, and who has the position and the authority to get things done. Because there is a lot of management, there is a lot of communication that needs to happen with the IT department, with the executive team, with other specialized units who may be interested in data, even with line prosecutors. So a PPI manager who can speak from a position of authority and get people on board with a project like this will be extremely helpful in making the project effective. So find your Caroline. Data ambassadors. This is a group of individuals that we found to be very useful for promoting the use of data outside the executive team in a prosecutor's office. So we recommend asking around internally in your office to figure out whether there are individual line prosecutors or IT folks who've been tracking data in some way on their own. You might be very surprised to learn that you've got some either ambitious or type A prosecutors who've been asking for data reports, or they've been keeping a spreadsheet of their own case outcomes for some time. And those individuals might be interested in participating in the project. It's a mindset among mid-level managers, among line prosecutors that you want to nurture and build upon. Because ultimately the success of any data project is going to rely on how the data that you produce gets used. You can create an external facing dashboard, but if it just sits there, what's the real value in it, right? So you want to have an office that sees the data on the dashboard or sees the data that's being provided to them, thinks about it critically, and figures out what an office is doing well and what you as an office can improve upon moving forward. So using the data in a meaningful way. And data ambassadors, those who understand the data and who are excited by it, can help you promote the kind of data related values that you want in that office. The last group that we recommend is a PPI working group. If you decide to implement a full PPI project, so say you want to interview some staff in your office, you want to survey people about attitudes or data from other office priorities or things like that, you will also likely want a small group of people who meet regularly, perhaps monthly or so, to keep the project going and take a little bit off the shoulders of your PPI manager. So this group would do things like finalize what to ask line staff in a survey. They would review the pilot PPI data that's created. They would make recommendations to the DA about what PPIs to put on an external facing dashboard, things like that. So these are all individuals or key groups that will help in the management of the project and in the formal implementation of it as well. If you get these 4 different individuals or groups going, you've got a pretty decent infrastructure to start a data project and have a good chance of it being successful. I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Caroline, I have to ask, as a PPI manager, in your own experience, how much time do you actually dedicate to working as a PPI manager and specifically on this project?
At this point, since we're in the analysis phase, there is actually a lot of my time that I spend on the project. But part of it is due to the fact that we have a brand new analyst that we were able to bring on board that just recently started up with our office a handful of months ago. And so, you know, if you are working with a small team and you're working with newer employees as a result of this project, then I think your PPI manager is going to be having to dedicate a little bit more time, because it's not only understanding the project, understanding all of the different PPI, but for a new analyst, it's providing that training in the background, right? Of here's how our case management system works. You know, this is how a felony case moves through the system, right? They have to understand the background in addition to the case management system and the data they're looking at, in addition to then applying it to the PPI. So, you know, as a PPI manager, just at the current stage we're at, there is actually a lot of effort that goes into vetting each PPI. I also think that there's a big difference if, hey, out of these 55, we're interested in about 5 to 10 PPI versus we want to do all 55, right? Like your time will definitely depend on how many you ultimately want to accomplish at the end of the day.
That's really helpful, Caroline. So would you say it's like, you know, 50% of your time or even more than that, or just depends on the day? And Rebecca, does that seem to ring true for many other PPI managers, that it's maybe dependent on the part of the process that they're at, or is it really just a big chunk of time dedicated throughout the life of the project?
So for me, it depends on the day, right? At the beginning of this, when we were just starting to have conversations with FIU about the project, it was 1 hour a week. But now that we're actually in the analysis phase, or we're looking at data, we're modifying data, we're actually trying to actively build our dashboards, it is a lot more time consuming currently.
Okay. Yeah, and I would say that the amount of time spent by the PPI manager and others on the project is going to be pretty directly proportional to the output, or how much comes out of it. So Caroline, when you say there's a difference between producing 5, or what it takes to produce 5 PPIs versus all 55, that I would say definitely resonates. Because there are definitely easier and harder indicators to create, more complex ones, and the ones that are sexy will often be the more complicated ones, of course. So it's kind of a matter of figuring out how much you have to invest in a project like this, how much resources, how much of your manager's time you're willing to devote. I also think the investment needed by the PPI manager can also be very dependent on your analytic capacity. So on, you know, how many and what type of data analysts you have. Caroline, I know that bringing new people on has created, you know, a little bit of inefficiency, ultimately for great cause, but, you know, it takes time to make that transition, and that takes up more of your time and energy. So offices that are kind of starting out with lower analytic capacity will have to kind of make decisions about how much other investment they're willing to make in order to compensate for that.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. So it does seem like it really is just sort of dependent on who else you have internally working with you and what their comfort level is with the work. But really the PPI manager is just there to ensure that all of it goes smoothly and all of it kind of continues on the path forward that you're looking for, and working with the elected to make sure that vision is what they envision as well. So moving on to the data ambassadors, because I do think that's a really big part of that key there. Caroline, how did you find your data ambassadors? You know, how many of them do you have in your office? And what would you say is like their most critical role in making sure that there is that sort of buy-in from your office staff?
Sure. So our data ambassadors cross over into our PPI work group. So they're kind of the same thing, although we have other data ambassadors that aren't part of the PPI working group. And for us, you know, it was a selling point: lend us your voices, lend us your knowledge, be part of the process. We want to be affecting policy change as we look through the data. You know, your role is very important. I was a little bit worried because, not a lot of people like working with data. It's all numbers, and that's not why we became lawyers. So I was a little worried that I might not get as many volunteers, but I was pleasantly surprised when I sent out an office-wide email basically asking for volunteers, that of the 70 attorneys in our office, 15 of them were very excited and very anxious to get on the PPI working group and to be supportive of this process and this project. And this is during a time where caseloads, because of the pandemic, have doubled, right? So these lawyers are busier than ever. They felt it was important enough to take time out of their busy schedules to be part of the project. So I think that offices will find, if they ask the right people and in the right way, they'll get a lot of really positive responses and encouraging amount of volunteers as part of this project.
That is really good to know, because you do hear, he didn't go to law school to work with numbers. So that's very comfortable to know. And I'm sorry, I cut you off, Rebecca.
Oh, no, of course. That's what happens on Zoom, right? I'm curious, Caroline, whether you feel like the responses that you got, or the people who were excited, did they come from particular parts of your office, or did they tend to be younger? Did they tend to be mid-level managers? Were they in specialized units? Like, where did those folks come from for you?
They came throughout the entire office. So young attorneys, chief deputies, supervisors of units. I know initially when we had a conversation, we were told, you want your more experienced DAs to be part of this work group. They bring probably more knowledge of the system as a whole, or how cases operate, more so than maybe the younger DAs. We felt it was really important, though, to include the younger voices. They come with a different perspective. And they can bring sort of the history of the project with them as they continue throughout the office, right? So if we only had supervisors that were, ready to retire within, 2 to 5 years, you would lose a lot of support, from starting this project where we're at. And so I felt like it was important to get that wide variety of new attorneys, supervisors, and everybody in between. So our data ambassadors and our PPI work group are pretty well spread throughout our office in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and experience in the office.
Thank you, Caroline. We actually also just received a question from the audience, which is the PPI analyzing data that is already being gathered in the case management system, or do staff in the office have to input additional data to accomplish the PPI analysis?
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to involve new data. So the idea is to start with data that's already being collected. And we'll get to this in just a couple of minutes also. But step one is figuring out what you can do with the data that you have. I would say, and Caroline can probably speak to this just as well, that the further you get into a data project, the more new ideas pop up, or the more things you realize you want that you didn't know you wanted before. And that will tend to yield a long list of new things that you'd like to collect moving forward. And then it's a matter of triaging what's important, what do we have the resources for, et cetera. But the PPIs are built to rely on data that prosecutors' offices may already collect, or may through other ways already have access to.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I just have one final question on staffing before we move on. You mentioned that there's the data ambassadors, which were sort of self, they kind of said themselves that they wanted to participate through this office-wide email that was sent. And then you have your analyst and your PPI manager. And you said mostly the working group is comprised of those data ambassadors. But if there are other people who are part of the working group that weren't part of the data ambassadors, could you describe a little bit of that internal conversation about how you decided who would be involved in this project and why?
Sure. So I also, in addition to sending out that office-wide email, I knew in my head, hey, I think, this prosecutor would be really good and bring value. So I'm going to personally, go to their office and ask them to be part of this project. So I also did sort of a one-on-one reach out too, which I think is very important to get, some of the right people right on the work group. But other data ambassadors might be purely from an input standpoint. So as we're doing some of the analysis, we're realizing that the data isn't truly reflective of actual practice. And it's because the users are making errors in their data entry. And so part of the conversation in terms of data ambassadors are, you know, hey, supervisors and victim advocates, we really need you on board to train up your victim advocates, or send out reminders that they need to do it accurately, because the data we're seeing coming out of the system looks wrong, right? And so then she becomes sort of this de facto data ambassador, because knowing what we're currently tracking and knowing what the end results currently look like, you know, she'll go back to her team and be like, here's why it's really important that every time you talk to a victim, you enter, you know, that event into our case management system, because our data is not truly reflecting the work that we do. And so, you know, it's a little bit of a organic process in that, you know, your data ambassadors might just pop up here and there, and you don't even realize you need them as data ambassadors, but they become it, you know, due to just trying to perfect the accuracy of your data.
I think this segues really nicely into talking about doing a data assessment. So in any data project that a prosecutor's office does, there should be a data assessment. You may also hear it referred to as like a data needs assessment or as a gap analysis. But it's kind of the foundation of any data project, PPIs or otherwise, because the process is all about developing a robust understanding upfront of what your current capabilities are, so that as you implement the project, you're not spending all of your time being surprised by what is or is not possible with your data. So first step in doing a data assessment, identify the electronic systems that you currently use to manage data internally. So most data required for the PPIs is expected to come from your case management system, but there are other systems in prosecutors' offices that collect data that may be useful for creating individual indicators. That could be HR data, that could be data collected by victim advocacy units, it could be data collected by community prosecution units or other specialty divisions. Those are just some examples. But figure out what all of those data sources are, because sometimes it's not really that well documented in a prosecutor's office what data is being collected, and just understanding the different sources of data is a very important first step. You may realize you're actually capturing some things in alternative databases that you didn't realize. The next question to ask is, in each of those systems you've identified, how is the data entered? Caroline, you just spoke to this a little bit. It's about asking, well, who's recording the data? How reliable and how accurate is it? So are we inputting it at the right time? Are we inputting it in a way that everybody uniformly understands what each code or each thing means, or does everybody have different definitions? One important element of that is figuring out which pieces of data are mandatory and which not every prosecutor in every case may be filling out. So if you have data on, say, time to victim contact, which you were just talking about, Caroline, but only some prosecutors who speak with victims are recording that information, it's questionable how useful that is actually going to be. You're going to have a lot of missing data, and you're not going to be sure which way that missing data skews. So thinking about those things, also considering when you make a change to data in your case management system, are you writing over existing information, or is it recording every iteration? A good example of this is how pretrial detention is often recorded in offices. Many case management systems that I've seen will allow a line staff to put in what the current detention status is of a defendant. But if, for example, they were detained for a short time, but then they paid bail, and so for a short period of time, they had that little detention box checked, but then, you know, by the time of disposition, the box was unchecked, there's not really a way of telling whether that person was detained, and if so, for how long. So some things like that in a case management system, data can be overwritten with the most current information. And that's something to consider when creating a number of PPIs. Next question, evaluate how data can be extracted from those different systems. So the word reports gets used a lot in prosecutors' offices. What kinds of reports can be run on case level data? So many case management systems, again, that we've seen will have a preset number of reports. You can almost just click a button and it will run a report telling you how many cases were filed between X and Y dates or something like that. But they're often fairly limited in the number of preset reports that you can do. That said, there is always underlying a case management system, a giant database that holds all the case level data you would need to produce PPIs. As long as you're filling in that data and inputting into the system, the data is somewhere underneath the system for you to extract. So figuring out what kind of reports you can run to get that data out of your system and who in your office already knows or is capable of quickly learning how to extract that data is important. Because you may collect a ton of data, but if you have absolutely no idea how to get it out of your system, then you're not going to be able to move forward and use it until you've actually figured that out, right? I'll make one other note here. If you're not sure whether your office can run case level reports and your case management system is run by a third-party vendor, talk to that vendor about your options. The vendor may be able to either extract data for you or teach someone in your office how to get data out of the system from their database. So these systems aren't typically built to accommodate the expectation that prosecutors are going to ask for their own data back. But there's always a way to do it. So unless the vendor decides to just stonewall you, there should be some way for you to get the data out of your case management system. Last point is data that's not collected in your office, but that you think is very important or that you want to track. Think about what other local or state agencies that you have a good relationship with may be collecting that data and would be willing and able to share it with you. So some data may come more easily from a sheriff's office, from a jail, from the clerk of courts, sometimes from other non-criminal justice agencies like health departments. So that's always something to consider. If you have a good relationship or you know that other local agencies have data capacities that you don't, consider reaching out or evaluating what data you might be able to get from them.
Thank you, Rebecca. Caroline, what was your data capacity like at the start of this project? And where are you now, and how did you go about expanding it if you did?
So from a personnel perspective, like I mentioned earlier, we did have one additional analyst that came on board, and I would say this is 90% of his job is just working this PPI. One thing in hindsight that I wish we had thought through a little bit more carefully is, as you're adding more analytic capacity sort of top, you do have to think about whether your foundation can support that additional weight, so to speak. And we didn't really think through expanding sort of the foundation of, IT's capacity to pull data in a timely fashion, because we only have one person doing that job. And so now she's very much backlogged in terms of all of the additional requests we've made of her, in addition to her job in this PPI project on top of that. And so, we're trying to grow foundationally in addition to the analysis, but it's been a slower process for us. But with the additional analytic capacity, we've gotten further than I thought possible to date.
That's really good to know. So do you use your case management system and other forms of electronic systems to get that information, or is it solely currently based on your case management system that you're extracting that data from?
So depending on the PPI, we're also using an HR system. So when we're talking about leadership and line staff diversity, we go to our HR and gather the data there. There's a lot of PPI that asks for, pre-detention data. So we would actually have to partner with our local sheriff's office to draw the data there to figure out whether our case management system talks, so that we can align the cases on the back end to figure out whether we file and who is in custody. Some of that can be very challenging. Our case management system is also very old, and so that is a challenge because we have a lot of difficulty in modifying what we can pull out of it. But I think the biggest challenge of all has definitely been to date trying to figure out what other agencies' data we need and whether they'd be willing to partner with us on it. Because it is a big ask, right, for us to reach out to the sheriff's office and say, hey, will you be willing to pull this monthly for us, right? Okay, well, what about quarterly? What about annually, right? If they don't have the capacity to kind of help us with that. So that's the challenge we're currently facing.
Did you put together any sort of data sharing agreement, or how did you go about kind of formalizing that partnership with sheriffs and other folks that you're trying to get some information from?
We already have a database that commingles data from the sheriff's office and our office. And those data sharing agreements have already been signed, but they need to be signed for individual projects. So for us, that is still a step we need to take. And then the next agency we worked with, and this was actually the first time we worked with them, was Bureau of Emergency Communications, so 911. And they actually had a lot of data that we didn't realize they had, one, and two, that they were very willing to share with us, and they have the capacity to share with us. So that is a new partnership that recently developed where we're like, oh, you are full of information that we would love to get our hands on. And so our hope is to grow that partnership there.
Great, that's really good to know. And just going back quickly to your CMS, I know you mentioned it's an older system. Did you have any concerns about the quality of your data coming out of that CMS?
We didn't have any concerns about the electronic pull, the data that was already in there. Our concerns after we looked at some of the data was how inaccurate was going in. So it was a data entry issues with either staff, line prosecutors, or victim advocates not putting in the data when they should. So our example that we brought up before was the one PPI talking about time to victim contact. Our victim advocates are extremely busy. They're dealing with more victims today than they ever were historically, and it's sometimes difficult for them to remember, right? Every time I place a call to a victim, I have to go back into our case management system and add that event so that it populates properly and is able to be pulled by IT, a month or two from now. And so I think that piece is all about training, all about understanding, hey, we're monitoring now. We're going to be giving you, monthly data analysis of this, and that's why it's really important for you to remember that. But it's difficult, right? Because their main concern is, are my victims safe? Do they need services? And not necessarily, putting that event into our case management system.
Yeah, creating a common understanding of how to input data can often be, like I say, useful, or it's an issue in offices, not necessarily for the date of a victim contact, but for example, there are several PPIs. There's a whole objective related to community engagement, and facilitating a better bridge between the community and the prosecutor's office. And one of the PPIs is about what percentage of prosecutors have engaged with the community over the previous month or quarter, year, whatever unit of time is being used. And different prosecutors can have different definitions of what it means to do community engagement, and what counts and what doesn't. So one thing we've run into, or we've seen offices run into, is realizing that different people have different approaches to inputting data, or they think the same data element will kind of mean 2 different or 3 or 5 different things. And trainings can help with that. Documenting the usage of different codes and types of data can be helpful, but that's another issue that comes up frequently. Not an issue, something to be improved.
Would the both of you suggest perhaps issuing guidance and getting started on this project, issuing guidance on appropriate ways to input data into the CMS, or potentially retraining staff before the beginning of this project, almost as a refresher for making sure that all of what is inputted is appropriate and also accurate, as well as consistent across all of the different people who are inputting things into the CMS?
It doesn't hurt, in my opinion. It doesn't hurt, but I personally don't think that you're going to see as much change as if you brought the finalized data to them and to show victim advocates, right? It says your first time to contact on average is 10 days. They're like, no, we know that it's within a day or two. Like, well, then that's why it's really important for you to have accurate data inputs, right? And remember to do it. You can tell them in the very beginning it's important for you to do this, but until they really understand why, I don't think you're going to see as many positive results than if they were actually to look at the data and then understanding it from there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's like a psychological thing too, right? Like, you're more likely to change your behavior if you know that there's a problem rather than that you've been told there might be one. So showing the results of poor data entry or lack of accuracy in data will go probably a much longer way toward convincing them to change their behavior and input things more accurately or in a more timely manner. Because we've certainly seen offices do that, and they're like, look, this isn't making you look good right now, but if you improve your data collection, you're going to look better. And they're like, oh, okay, great.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting tip and almost something I wouldn't think of. I would think, let's be proactive about making sure everybody gets this right. But I think you're right. There is a real benefit to explaining and showing the difference and what the errors could really do, especially when you're sharing this information publicly. And we did receive one question from the audience, which is, what are some of the top ways that you utilize this data, and did you receive pushback initially?
So Rebecca, we're not quite there yet with our jurisdiction because we haven't made any of our data points public facing yet. I will say there hasn't been any internal pushback yet, but again, we haven't gotten to the point where we're really sharing our data. I don't know about the other sites, Rebecca.
Yeah, the PPIs are designed to promote change in policy at the office level. So we never advocate for office level data being used to convince individual line prosecutors to change their behavior, to change the way they would make a given decision in the case. It's more about changing policies or figuring out what policies might be useful for making small changes that will affect trends. So, I mean, data on racial disparity is always a big one, in that people pay a lot of attention to the data that comes out of the analysis and are very cognizant of figuring out, or very interested in figuring out ways to make changes where they do see disparities. So one office, this is an example we use a lot, found that their diversion rate was lower than they expected it to be, and that there were racial differences in what racial and ethnic groups were being diverted. As is the case in many offices, defendants of color were less likely to enter diversion. And in digging around and trying to figure out, like, well, is this caused by line prosecutors not offering diversion to people of color as much? Is it that people of color are less often eligible? Is it they're not accepting it as much? Those are very high level questions, and they take a long time to think about and figure out solutions to. But one thing they realized that was artificially driving down their diversion rate was that they were sending out their diversion offers by paper mail. And that defendants who were unhoused or who had moved, who moved more frequently, were just probably not getting the diversion offers. And anytime the diversion offer arrives to a residence where the person doesn't live and they don't respond to it, it just goes down as a declination. So though the defendant declined the offer, we're going to proceed with prosecution. So that was a pretty clear area where they could make a policy change, figure out a different way to get diversion offers to defendants that has helped them increase their diversion rate and reduce racial disparities. They've done some other things as well, but that's just one example. That's the kind of policy change that we're talking about. They're not always huge, widespread changes, but even little policies can make differences. And that's what the PPIs are geared toward. All right, we can move through this slide fairly quickly, but this specific to the PPIs, the process of using data from your office to create PPIs, which are trend lines. They're data measured over time, either on a monthly, quarterly, or annual basis. You want to answer 3 questions. Which PPIs can be measured using data that you have, data that comes out of your case management system, that comes from other systems within your office, or that comes from other local agencies? Question 2 is, what indicators could be measured with small alterations? Because sometimes while the exact PPI could not be measured, the PPIs are designed to be customizable, both in terms of the value, the priorities that they reflect in your office, but also based on your existing data capacity. So if you can't, for example, measure community engagement in quite the same way that the PPIs describe it, maybe there's an alternative way that you can measure it that actually better reflects the way you're doing community engagement in your office. The third question is which PPIs would be feasible to measure moving forward. Highly advise you to keep, as you go through this project, a wish list of data elements that you believe would be useful to systematically collect. Whether diversion always creates a lot of interesting opportunities. You know, offices will say, well, we don't actually know who we're offering diversion to, but then the defendants are in turn declining our offer. So a little checkbox in our case management system that allows the prosecutor to say, yes, I offered diversion, would go a long way toward helping us figure out whether the issue is that we're not offering diversion as much or that defendants are not accepting it as much. So that wish list can really come in handy. And some of the data changes that you decide you want or you wish for moving forward may actually be easier to add than you think.
Thank you, Rebecca. I now see that we have the 5-minute mark, but I do just want to ask one quick question about this, which is if you discover that there is something you want to measure and it's not currently captured by your CMS or other external systems that you're gathering information from, could you walk us through the process of what steps to take to make alterations to ensure future measurement? And this could be for either of you.
So I'll give you an example. So we are meeting regularly with FIU on these measurements, and we're constantly altering it when either we don't have the data to do the PPI as as a sort of designed, or if it doesn't fit our particular jurisdiction. So one example is time to disposition. They're currently using ABA standards, and so we had asked, well, in place of using ABA standards, we have our own Oregon standards, right? Where the Supreme Court said, no, this is the time frame we want you to actually get your cases to trial. So would that be a better indicator, since that's what we're currently operating under, than the ABA standards? And so adjusting it there, right, to meet our jurisdiction's needs. But as we were looking at time to disposition, we also realized that we have a really bad FTA and bench warrant rate in our county. And so a lot of times we're not able to meet our own timelines because it's the defendant who's bench warring or failing to appear at these court appearances. And so then we started asking ourselves, well, none of the PPIs are actually asking about FTAs or bench warrants, but if that's an issue for our jurisdiction, is that something that we can start looking at in combination with the PPI that's talking about time to disposition? So those are the types of conversations that we have as we start looking at our data.
Yeah, the two big components of making a data change are A, making the technical change in the system so that a prosecutor who wants to put in, or an administrative support staff who wants to put that information in has a clear place to do so. That'll depend on your IT staff or the person who manages or manipulates your case management system. But the other piece of it is either making it mandatory or making sure that everybody is invested in actually recording the information that you've now given them the option to record. Because again, we kind of talked about this already, but different prosecutors may have a different way of deciding what information to put in the system. Some may not choose to use your new codes unless you make it mandatory or show them why it's important. And so you have to make sure everybody who inputs data and who records things is on the same page when you add new data elements. So it's a process. Okay, so I guess really quickly, I'll make a couple of notes for small offices, and these are pretty, I guess, basic. Since we have gotten a number of questions from small or rural offices who are interested in using data but just don't have the capacity for a full project, you always, anytime you do any sort of data project, start with a data assessment and a staff capacity assessment. In small offices, it will probably be fairly quick because you already know everybody in your office and you know even the IT staff. And for a project like this, your IT or data analyst may be the only key person involved, and that's totally okay. Because the smallest data project you can do might just include creating annual workflow measures. And that's, if you're not sure what your data capacity is, always start with those kinds of measures. So how hard is it for you to calculate the total number of cases that are referred to your office? Total number of cases that are filed or disposed? Are you able to break down cases by disposition type? So can you tell what % of your cases are convicted? results in a conviction? What percent results in a diversion or a dismissal? Things like that. There are a couple other examples there. Break it down by offense category, break it down by racial or ethnic or other demographic information of defendants. But even that is a significant step forward if you're not currently able to capture those types of indicators, because that will go a long way towards showing you what you're able to do and help you figure out the process of extracting data, which can always be a challenge if it's never been done before. So it's 4 p.m. Should I stop there?
You could finish up your slide, no worries.
If you decide to move forward with PPIs as a small office, start by trying to do, again, annual or maybe twice a year measures. You don't have to measure everything on a quarterly or a monthly basis. Do whatever period of time makes sense for you, and start with indicators that you feel comfortable with. And then see how that process looks and feels. And you will probably find that once you've got those initial PPIs in order, that more become possible because you've made adjustments through the process that make those more efficient. And my last point was one of the future webinars will be about community engagement, but offices of any size can engage with their community and give local community members more of a voice. So data should be used as a way to communicate your priorities, what you value to your communities, but it should also be a reflection of what your community values and expects from your prosecutor's office. So using data, using any type of data to communicate is good, but if data is not available, you can always go directly to community members, organize listening tours, or just otherwise speak with individuals in the community about their feelings of prosecution, about what they want or what they need from the prosecutor's office. And that's something that offices of all sizes can do.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I know getting that community feedback is really invaluable. So I think that was a great way to end. I know we are at our hour mark. There was a question about the slides. We are happy to share the slides in the presentation with all the webinar attendees. So look out for an email that will be coming from APA that will have those slides available to you all. So just wanted to very quickly thank you so much, Rebecca and Caroline, for your insights. They're extremely valuable for any office interested in really just using and tracking data generally, but also implementing PPIs. Thank you to our webinar audience in attendance. This webinar was recorded. Like I mentioned earlier, this is in a series. So this is the second in a series. We actually have already done 4 webinars on PPIs. All of them are on our APA website, apainc.org, which you could access all of the webinars and the different materials there. If you have any questions about that or any concerns about this webinar, please email us at webinars@apainc.org. Once again, thank you for attending. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.